Okay, we are now recording this lecture on the geography of the East Coast. Sorry about that. Good morning. And let me give you an overview of what the slides look like for this little piece of the pie here. There we go. It's up and running now. Start by looking at the whole country a little bit, and then focus on the three regions of the East Coast, the South, the New England states, colonies, and the middle colonies. And we'll just be looking to have a summary question at the end for each of the three main regions on the East Coast. And I want to start with distinguishing the West Coast general geographic feature, which is the mountains meeting the shore, versus the East Coast, which is pretty much flat along the Atlantic coast over here. On the West Coast, you have, as those of you that have driven Route 1 or Route 101 up in Oregon and Washington, you're aware of the fact that it's basically a very mountainous coastline, a rough, sort of unwelcoming coastline, except in a few key harbors and ports. San Francisco Bay, Puget Sound in and around Seattle, and San Diego Bay are the three natural, fabulous ports on the West Coast, and just three. You can build a pier down here at San Pedro near Long Beach, and in Monterey, as you know, and there are other places where you can kind of manipulate the coast to set up a port for an ocean-going vessel. But on the East Coast, there are literally hundreds and hundreds of natural ports, rocky coves off the coast of New England, going up river valleys here for New York and Pennsylvania and Philadelphia, and then all along the coastal plain, which is, once you get around the sandbars that are right here on the coast, you can find safe harbor in and along many of the rivers of the coastal plain, which we'll show you in just a moment. So there are three regions on the East Coast of the United States: New England, the Middle Atlantic colonies, and the Southern colonies. New England, most of you know, is this chunk up here of the northeastern, generally small states today of Connecticut, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, and Massachusetts actually controlled Maine. The state now of New Hampshire was disputed territory all along. The middle colonies are pretty much New York, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey. Yes, we can throw Delaware in there, even though now we don't have to throw Delaware into anything. These are the middle colonies here. So everything south of this line, this border between Pennsylvania and the state of Maryland, which maybe you can see better a little bit over here, everything south of that line directly is the South. And the two northernmost colonies there are often called the Chesapeake, right? That would be Virginia and Maryland around Chesapeake Bay. And the lower south of North and South Carolina and Georgia, the last of the English colonies to be founded. Okay, in the South itself, there are three regions going from the ocean, from the east to the west. The three big regions are the coastal plain here, the flat area along the shore, which is pretty much all along the Atlantic coast, from New York on down. Flat land that is about 40, it's more than that. 60 to 100 miles or even farther inland is how wide the coastal plain is. And that's basically land that's really close to sea level. Then you get the Piedmont here, the foothills, literally, Piedmont means foot hills, to the third region, the westernmost region in the southern colonies, and that is the Appalachian Mountains. And we'll talk about each of these three regions of the South. So we're just talking about the southernmost of the three regions, and within that, there are three regions moving east to west. And I want to talk about each of them for a second. The coastal plain is, as this map kind of illustrates to you, for the Virginia rivers that go across the coastal plain, this is uniquely watered all along here. Wherever you take an ocean-going vessel, that it makes that river a navigable one. And navigable is just a term we use for a river deep enough to support an ocean-going vessel. Now, it may not support it all the time, just at high tide, because the coastal plain is just about at sea level. A whole bunch of it is uniquely influenced by the tides. The ships would come up the river with the tides and go out as the tide goes out. Now, along the coastal plain here, it has amazingly fertile topsoil. So the kinds of crops that you can grow there, and given the fact that it is so accessible to ocean-going vessels, market-related trade will be the order of the day in the coastal plain. So if you're one of the early settlers along here from Europe, England, and able to get a farm, a large farm, what we'll start to call plantation, along one of these coastal plain rivers, odds are you're going to be fairly profitable in producing goods for export, especially tobacco, in the Chesapeake colonies. And there will be no need for towns along the coastal plain. There really are virtually no towns in the colonial period. A few, yes, but for the most part, this is agricultural and very spread out European population as they settled in the 17th century. The foothill is this section here, which is also distinguished by good crops, good soil for crops, I should say. But the farmers that live in this region, the Piedmont, have to somehow drag their goods to this point, the dividing line between the coastal plain and the Piedmont, which is the fall line. The fall line is the head of navigation on any river, and all rivers that flow into the ocean have a fall line, a point at which you can no longer go up this river, the James River, to trade, to bring an ocean-going vessel. So farmers in the Piedmont bring their goods to the fall line, and that's where towns emerge in these southern colonies. Towns will spring up all along the fall line, all throughout the South. Look at Washington, D.C. is right on a fall line. Richmond, Virginia, Raleigh, North Carolina. The fall line is, the farmers that live there are slightly less profitable than the farms in the coastal plain, but they're still able to engage in market agriculture. Now, the Appalachian Mountains is a distinct mountain range. It's different looking than the Sierra Nevadas or the Rocky Mountains that we might be more familiar with in the West. This is geologically a much older range, so it's kind of worn down, rounded, and less of a barrier to settlers. Nevertheless, it's enough of a barrier that you can't get roads built going straight into this. You can kind of see it on this map. The Appalachian Range is about 7 parallel ridges all along the spine of the Appalachians with valleys in between. So it's Valley Ridge, Valley Ridge, Valley Ridge, Valley Ridge, Valley Ridge, Valley Ridge, Valley Ridge. And it's settled later, probably a century later than most of this area of the southern colonies. And settlers tended to get into one of these valleys by entering at the northern end of it in Pennsylvania and then just going south down one of these valleys until they got to a point where there was no more white settlement, and they just said, okay, this next 160 acres will be mine, or whatever they claimed and could pay for at the Colonial Land Office, or not. They just squatted on it. The people that inhabited Appalachia tended to be poorer than the folks that lived in the Piedmont and in the coastal plain. A lot of them are Scots and Irish and Scots-Irish, and they would be very content to live out here with their own land. And they're subsistence farmers. They are not, they're subsistence farmers. They're not trying to get goods from the Appalachian region to market. There's no way to get it there. There's no overland way to get out of those valleys easily. So they basically were out there in isolation, growing mostly corn as their subsistence crop out there. And that becomes kind of the norm for North American farmers is to grow corn more than wheat or barley. Corn has many more uses, more variety of ways to consume it. It stores better than wheat, and it makes a better animal feed, a much better animal feed. So a lot of the corn of Appalachia is turned into pork as these farmers came with their families and their pigs and hogs and chickens and a few cattle and turned their extra corn, or the corn they needed, into meat, which they would then smoke and hang in smokehouses and cure and salt and make last for a year or so in these smokehouses, the Virginia hams and bacon kind of being the main meat products out there. But these folks are eating corn any way they can, as corn oil and popcorn and corn on the cob and cream of corn and grits and you name it. There are many, many different ways to eat corn, and they found them all. And then whatever was left over from all that after feeding the hogs and the family, sometimes you distill that extra corn into bourbon whiskey, which is a distinctive American drink of the Appalachian region. Okay, so that's the South. New England is a very different kind of geography, and principally if impacted by the last ice sheet that covered the northern part of North America about 20,000 years ago. And as the ice sheet spread southward, it pushed the topsoil in front of it in many cases. And so what you're left with up here in New England is a lot of rocky ground with not a lot of topsoil left there. I think this is an interesting map to show all the glaciation, including the Sierra Nevada Glacier and the Yellowstone Glacier that we still enjoy. The Great Lakes, as you see here, are all just melted glaciers, basically. But in New England, what they will do in order to survive, they being English settlers in the period after 1620, they will use the many, many, many ports and harbors here, and they'll get involved in cutting down the thick forests of New England and building ships out of that lumber, shipping lumber back to Europe as a agricultural product. But the ships that they built would allow them to fish these waters, which they continue to do in New England and off the coast of Canada, and trade. Very likely a lot of the goods that came into ports in other parts of the colonies might have been ships built or that came out of the ports of New England. So timber, shipbuilding, trade, fishing, and then fur trapping, dealing with the Native Americans up the upper reaches of the Connecticut River or in the uniquely ponded, that's not a word, regions of the mountainous areas here of New Hampshire and Maine, would yield a lot of furs, mostly beaver pelts, and usually traded with Native Americans. So that's kind of the New England situation. What I guess I want to emphasize is you can farm New England and make enough food to survive on. Your family can survive, but it's not likely they're going to be gaining a lot of profits from straight agricultural produce in New England. So they did these other things. The middle colonies are a combination of the South and New England. They're kind of easy to describe once you understand what the South and New England are like. Just kind of combine that and you end up with the middle colonies. Great farmland in the Delaware River Valley, in the Hudson River Valley, in the Susquehanna River Valley of Pennsylvania. So much great farmland and so easy to access harbors and ports through these rivers that they ended up growing a lot of wheat in these colonies, and they become known as the bread colonies, exporting wheat all over the world especially out of their major ports, New York City here and Philadelphia here on the Hudson and Delaware rivers, respectively. And they engaged in a good amount of fur trading up in the forested, more upland regions of the mountain regions here, and lots of trade with Native Americans. Just last thing, there's just a diversity of immigrant groups. If southern colonies were to a huge extent peopled by the immigrants of, in addition to the Native American peoples who are there, who we'll talk about in another lecture. But most of the southern colonies were settled by English immigrants up till 1675, 1680, almost completely English immigrants, and then a lot of African slaves were brought. But in New England, it is almost 100% English immigrants that came there. The middle colonies, they came from everywhere. They came from Germany, from Scotland, from Ireland, from the Netherlands, from Sweden, from all sorts of different parts of Northwestern Europe. And so there's a good amount of diversity in the kinds of cultures that emerge in the middle colonies. And we'll talk more about that. Okay, so we'll end with just kind of asking you to reflect upon the chief geographic characteristics of each of those three regions and try to speculate a little bit about the kind of society that might emerge with this kind of geographic foundation to their settlement. Okay. Thanks much.